Welcome to Global Finance Rewired, the new podcast series where we explore the reform of the international financial architecture. My name is Bodo, I'm with Global Policy from Europe, and I'm going to be your host. Today is our first episode. We're going to discuss tax and tax justice. More specifically, we want to look at the new United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. That's a brand new initiative at the United Nations, which aims to promote inclusiveness, but also new global rules on taxes. The expert joining us today is Chenai Mukumba. Chenai is the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa. Chenai has been deeply involved in advocating for fairer tax systems and has recently authored also an insightful article titled The UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. What do we want to achieve? Chenai, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bodo. I'm so excited to be a part of the first session of your series.
Yeah, to set the stage, could you explain the significance of the UN's recent effort to establish a framework convention on international tax cooperation?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, this issue is monumental. It is historic, particularly for those of us that have been working on tax justice issues within the continent. So to give a little bit of context, this idea of a UN tax body, or really the centrality of the UN on tax issues, dates back to the early 2000s, when the issue of illicit financial flows really came to the fore within the tax justice conversation on the continent. And so very simply put, illicit financial flows were really the resources that were leaving the continent, resources that were being generated, but essentially were finding themselves outside of the continent, and so subsequently weren't able to be invested into various developmental objectives. And so what happened was in 2015, a report was put out that was chaired by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. And what it flagged were the number of different ways we needed to address this issue of illicit financial flows on the continent. And so it flagged that at national level, we need to, for example, strengthen our tax administrations, put in place transfer pricing units. We need to improve legislation. At the regional level, we need to cooperate better to address things like harmful tax competition. But then what it also indicated was that in addition to a lot of the domestic and regional processes we needed to put in place, there was also a role that the global community also had to play to address the loss of these financial resources that were leaving the continent. And this is really where we see some of the initial writing about the role of the United Nations, the centrality of the UN in helping curb the illicit financial flows from a global perspective. And so that's really the significance of this discussion. And now, close to 10 years later, we are seeing it come to fruition. We finally saw the Africa Group table a proposal that was adopted. And now this year, we're actually starting to see the first ever global negotiation platform of tax happening within the United Nations.
But as you say, the problem is known for a long time, and there have been structures in place for international tax cooperation, mostly under the umbrella of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. What challenges have African countries been facing under these previous structures, or why did they push so strongly for having new bodies under the umbrella of the United Nations?
Absolutely, and I think that's a great question. So right now, the body that really governs the global tax system is, as you've mentioned, the OECD. And right now, the problem with the OECD, the problems of the OECD are several-fold. First and foremost, when you think about the OECD, particularly the inclusive framework, right, which is where the global tax conversations are happening, not all African members are part of that platform. And so subsequently, they're not involved in the discussions that are happening with regards to the global tax system that have direct implications on themselves, right? So the first point about the OECD is that it's not truly inclusive, even though it bears the name, right, of an inclusive framework. And so that's the first issue. The second is that even for those countries that are members of the inclusive framework, they don't participate in equal footing. And so you don't really see, particularly global South countries, African countries, participate in the agenda setting or really sort of meaningfully decision making when it comes within the inclusive framework. And the most recent example of that was really when we started to see countries need to make choices about the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 processes that were being proposed by the OECD. So from the African continent, both Nigeria and Kenya essentially said that they were not happy with what was being proposed and they wouldn't sign on, yet the discussion still continued, right? And so when particularly you hear the OECD say, oh, it's consensus-based and everybody has equal footing, situations like that really sort of make us beg the question, right, whether it truly is equal footing and, as I mentioned earlier, inclusive in that sense.
Okay, and I mean, you mentioned illicit financial flows already, but when we look at the, at the topics on the agenda of the new tax convention process, what do you think are the most important results that the African countries want to achieve through this process?
So I think, while you might not see the IFF issue sort of central right now to the conversation, at the end of the day, I think the first thing people need to recognize is that this is a long, drawn-out process that needs to take place. And so essentially what we see is that it's not one of the areas that's going to be tackled immediately. The areas that are going to be tackled now are essentially being deemed early protocols. And so these are the issues that, due to consensus, right, have been arrived at to tackle first and foremost. But I think overall, when you ask the question about what are the Africa Group's motivations and objectives, I think you can really see this in the title of the proposals that they've been putting forward, which is really the promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation, right? So inclusive in the sense that everybody must have a say. And sometimes that might mean that Africa's agenda is not at the forefront, right? That's what happens when you have an inclusive forum. But at the end of the day, everybody needs to contribute in that decision making. And then secondly, effective, right? Second, the point around this is that when you think about illicit financial flows, the amount of resources we've been losing over the past 10 years since the first sort of calculations were put in place has been increasing, right? So there's questions around the effectiveness of the current global tax rules that we have in place and the extent to which we can improve that by working together.
So, one innovation is just the governance structure as such, that everyone has a seat at the table. And the second is that we can, achieve better results in international tax cooperation. One important issue for CSOs is also the question, we have lots of campaigns on tax the rich and promoting progressive taxation. Do you think that the new tax convention could help in this regard as well?
Absolutely. So particularly the topic of taxing the rich, taxing high net worth individuals was a topic that the South American grouping saw as particularly important. And so if you take a look at the terms of reference of the negotiations that are currently taking place, you'll note that taxation of high net worth individuals is one of those areas that's deemed important for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to address. So absolutely, the campaigns around tax the rich will find a home within the UN as and when those discussions come to the fore for negotiation.
Okay, and when we look at the process, it seems that we're going to have a main convention, and you already mentioned we're going to have several protocols. And the step where we are now is that the United Nations, the member states, adopted terms of reference, which sort of outlined this a little bit. What are the next steps going to be, and what are the challenges that might arise as we are moving forward in this very political process?
So first and foremost, we're going to have many, many challenges. And I want to put that up front, right? Because a lot of people have been looking at the challenges that we're currently confronting as reasons for not to go forward with this process, right? And I find that a little problematic, right? I think at the end of the day, the process that we're currently undertaking is a process that's supposed to not really underpin, but really address issues that have been existing, systemic issues that have plagued our global tax system for decades, right? So it was never going to be a tricky process. I think it's a process that we need to understand will be fraught with tensions and various interests, right? But it's worth it. I think at the end of the day, once we get through this process, ultimately we're going to find ourselves with a platform that not only is inclusive, but as a result of that inclusivity, puts in place global tax rules that genuinely will benefit all. that genuinely will be able to cater to the different needs, different complexities and realities of all countries that are at the platform. So I always want to put that front and center, that it was always going to be a process that was difficult. But I think at the end of the day, when thinking about what's happening now, so we have in place an intergovernmental negotiating committee, right, where all countries have a seat at the table and can contribute to the process. The first outcome, the first output that's going to come from that is going to be the Framework Convention itself. And this, in a sense, is almost the mother agreement, right, that's going to undergird the decisions that are going to be taken by this UN tax body. And then ultimately, we're going to have a number of different protocols that are almost drawn from this Framework Convention that start to give a lot more detail to the issues, right, that this body wants to tackle. So the first protocol that the INC is negotiating is one on cross-border services, right? And this is a very topical issue because the global economy now looks very different than it did 50, 60 years ago when you think about particularly these massive multinational corporations that are within the digital economy space, right? How do we tax them? Because many of the rules that govern the global tax system don't apply to them, right? And so that's what that first particular protocol is supposed to address. And then the second protocol is going to essentially be looking at dispute resolution and dispute prevention, right? What do we do when countries are finding themselves in conflict with regards to tax issues? Again, an important issue. And I just want to add here that this issue didn't come from the Africa group, and neither did it come from South Americans. The point I make here is to say that it's inclusive in the sense that even European countries, Western countries, are able to place agendas at the table that will be negotiated. And so this particular protocol, the second protocol, is really supposed to address that. And ultimately, what we're hoping for is that by the end of 2027, we will have 3 different agreements that countries will be able to come together and agree on.
Well, let's come to your own role. I mean, you work for a civil society organization, Textures Network Africa. As far as I know, CSO, civil society organizations, have already been quite influential in kicking off this process in the first place. So you campaigned for many years for that, and I understand that CSOs are also directly involved in the negotiations that are taking place at the United Nations. So what would you say are the roles that CSOs will play in the coming 2-3 years, or what are the roles that CSOs should play to take this process forward?
So I'd say I'd sort of I think categorize the role of civil societies into sort of 4 broad buckets, right? The first is that there is a lot of civil societies out there that do fantastic research, right? And I think at the end of the day, for civil societies that particularly have a strength in that area, I would strongly encourage them to churn out that research because it essentially feeds into the current process, right? So whether it's research that's being done on the way framework conventions are put together, or some of the things that member states need to be thinking about from a cross-border services perspective, I think that's one key role that civil societies can play, because you'll find that often, because of the openness and transparency of this process, there's often asks, right, by both the member states themselves as well as the Secretariat for inputs into discussions. And so I would say that's the first. The second is that civil society can actually play a strong advocacy role here, in the sense that, again, because the negotiations are open, as a civil society, you can actually see, number one, whether your member state is in the room, right? But number two, what they're saying. And you don't actually have to be in New York or Nairobi to do so. You can follow the conversations on the UN web TV. So essentially follow the conversations. And if you see an issue that you feel you'd really like to see tabled, you can engage in advocacy with your governments. The third thing I would say is awareness raising. I don't think there's enough people that are aware of this conversation that's happening. And the reason you've just seen my voice rise is because I think we find ourselves at a moment where multilateralism is being questioned, right? Where the conversations about whether governments or countries can work together are at the fore. And thirdly, whether or not the global economy can essentially provide for the needs of global South countries. What's happening at the UN within the tax space is really, for me, an example of just that, right? So let's do some awareness raising to ensure that everybody knows the potential of what can happen when countries come together. And then lastly, I think the point I would say here is that for those civil society that can get to New York or that can get to Nairobi, there's opportunities for you to actually contribute to the discussions, right? There's an opportunity for you to raise your mic and feed into the conversations. This is not something that we saw available to all groups, particularly with conversations that were happening at the OECD. And so that's a fourth area that civil society can take in order to input into this current conversation.
Great. So I think that many of our listeners or viewers are from civil society organizations. So it's good to get such concrete guidance from you on how we can basically engage and how we can make the tax convention process a success. Thank you very much, Chenai. I mean, is there any final message you want to convey to our audience?
Absolutely. I think if I was to be asked, as you've just done, what would be my final thoughts? I think it would be to say that at the end of the day, what we need in order to address issues of poverty, in order to address issues of inequality, in order to provide basic public services, in order to address human rights, is financial resources, right? And the conversation that we're having now is about how to ensure that governments have the adequate resources to meet all of these different objectives that we try to achieve. The SDGs, for example, they don't meet themselves. They need resources to do so. So everybody really should be interested in this conversation, because ultimately it affects and impacts almost every single angle of our daily lives.
Thanks, indeed. And this was a good closing remark, because indeed, I mean, the whole session of podcast is about how to mobilize more financing for public services, more financing for development. And of course, taxes, this is why we started with taxes, is a key. Tax justice is a key pillar to promote, basically. Well, thank you, Chenai. This wraps up our first episode of Global Finance Rewired. If you found this discussion enlightening, we would like you to please subscribe, share, or leave us a review, and stay tuned for our next episodes, where we discuss about topics like debt architecture reform, climate finance, and also reforms of the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much.